To honor all copyright restrictions, we may have removed some audio elements from this message. And now, may you be blessed as you give attention to the reading of God's Word.
And our first passage today is from the Gospel of Matthew. Hear these words. You have heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you so that you will be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. And from the first chapter of James we read, know this, my dear brothers and sisters, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. This is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness. If those who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of His Word. You may be seated.
I find it difficult to talk to older generations just because either I'm written off as a dumb kid or I am just completely attacked for my point of view because it's different than theirs.
I think it's okay for our generations to see things differently.
At the end of the day, we can all disagree on what the issues are, but we need to have that mutual respect and kindness for each other to agree to disagree.
I think this is important because we have to know how to work together as a society. When we can't work together, things break down.
Ultimately, we're all Americans, we're all humans. We all have to come together, and in doing so, we have to understand that there might be differences, and those differences are usually to be celebrated.
I think that just being open to listening is the most important thing, and realizing that everyone's opinion is different and it's valid.
Ultimately, all of these issues that we're seeing, regardless of whether you're a millennial or not, Jesus is calling on us to, reach across the aisle, reach out of our comfort zone and get out of our bubble. I think we all just need to be kind to each other and really do a better job of listening and finding common ground.
I think that just relationships with people are what are gonna change this world. Having open conversations and having conversations where you're willing to listen to the other person.
You can either learn by living or you can learn by listening.
Listen.
Listen.
Listen. Listen.
Listening.
Listen.
Listen.
I'd like to invite you to take your bulletin. You're going to find there's a place to take notes. There are two big ideas in this sermon. I would love for you to write those down and whatever else you want to remember. However you feel like God is speaking to you, write those things down. And then you can discuss them with your family after the service or with friends. You'll notice there's scripture readings at the bottom of that. I'd like to invite you to take the time to read the Bible on your own in the coming week. So today we kick off a sermon series in which we're going to be listening. We're going to be listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z. We're going to listen to their voices, not because they are the future, but because they are the present. The two largest generations in America today, we're going to be listening for them as they're asking questions about the really big issues, the things that they're concerned about in our world today. And we're going to, with them, ask, what would Jesus say about these things? And then we're going to say, how can we across generations work together to address these really big, critical issues? And Christmas Eve candlelight, somebody sent me an email after that, and they said, yeah, I was sitting there listening as you played the promo with those young people talking about these issues and what we're going to do. And he said the person sitting next to me leaned over to his wife and said, well, we're not going to be going to hear any of that nonsense. Now, I'm assuming that person is not here today, so I can say this. But I want the rest of you to hear this. If you think listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, and you don't really care to hear those voices, if you're in business, you're going to be out of business in 30 years. If you think listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, you're going to have a terrible relationship with your children and your grandchildren. If you think listening to their voices is nonsense and you care about the church, your church, this one or any other, has no future if you're not listening to the voices of Millennials and Gen Z. So we're going to listen. We surveyed 500 Millennials and Gen Z in our own congregation, and we gave them a list of topics that show up in every national survey as top concerns for Millennials and Gen Z, and we said, which of these are the most urgent to you? And we picked the 4 that they listed, and we're going to cover those each week, and again, we're going to ask the question, what would Jesus say about these things? And what can we then do in response? So I want to begin by reminding you of the various generations when we talk about generations. And if you could give me the iPad, I want to remind you, first of all, that there's another generation on here. This generation is often called the greatest generation right here. And these folks are still alive, some. The youngest of them is 92. And so we live for the first time in history in a time where there are 6 generations that are alive at the same time on our planet. 6 generations. So not that there haven't been times where there were occasionally that kind of generations, but with a large populace of these. So we have the greatest generation, and then we have the silent generation, born 1928 to 1945. It just reminds you the things that shaped this generation, the Great Depression and World War II. All right, they were shaped by these 2 critical events and their life experiences, children growing up during the Depression, or some of them were teenagers and came of age during the Depression and went off to fight in World War II, and their family members, the smaller or the younger of these folks in this generation, lost parents or siblings in the war. This had a profound shaping effect on their lives, and they became frugal and responsible and a whole host of other things. And we come to 1946 to 1964 when 2 million GIs came back from the war and started having babies, and that began the baby boom. And these folks today are aged 55 to 73. I'm 55 and find myself right here at this point. And just to remind you, this generation was a generation that experienced huge, major culture shifts in the world around us. So there was Elvis was part of that culture shift. There was no longer a war that was being fought in Europe. Instead, there was the Cold War and the atomic bomb. And the exercises in school were hiding under your desk in case there was an atom bomb that was dropped, as though that was actually going to help you. There was a major shift in concerns for civil rights for everyone. Starting in the 1950s, that became something that shaped this generation, and this generation shaped, and all the way through Dr. King and all the rest. And then, of course, there was the advent of the birth control pill, which fundamentally shaped how women plan or families plan for having children, but also sent a whole bunch of women into the workplace. And suddenly there was a time where there were kids who were going to be raised in homes where there weren't either mom or dad at home. That gives rise to the next generation. So if we look at this, that's Generation X. And Generation X, born 1965 to 1980, were also known as the latchkey kids because their moms and dads were both at work. The millennials, or not the millennials, the baby boomers also had a tendency to decide, somewhere along the way, we're not going to stay in a marriage when we're really unhappy in this marriage. And so we saw a huge rise in divorces. And so the Generation X that came after that were the generation whose parents were either more likely divorced or their parents were both in the workplace. So latchkey kids. And this was a generation that at the same time was the first ones to really get their hands on computers. As they were coming of age, computers were really being developed. There's a whole host of other things that were happening during this generation. They gave us the Sony Walkman and a whole host of video games and a lot of other great stuff. And they were originally known as slackers, but ends up they were really hard workers, but they also cared very much about a work-life balance because they watched both their parents working like crazy to get ahead and have a higher life standard, and they realized they paid the price for that sometimes. Then there's the generations we want to focus on today for a moment. 1981 to 1996, the millennials, and those born after 1997 or 1997 beyond, Generation Z. So let's take a look at those real quick, and I want you to remember that the generation that grew up with these in their home were the millennials. All right, so finally there were computers in everybody's house. This is a Macintosh computer from 1984, and just before they were born, but maybe they saw these in their grandparents' house when they were growing up. But computers in the home. And it wasn't just computers, there was a whole host of other things that shaped this generation. This was one of the most pivotal events. And they watched this in their classrooms at school. And they watched it over and over and over again, and then the whole aftermath of terrorist attacks. This was something that they had that no other generation had ever had before. They were connected. It was the internet. They had access to information from around the world. They could be connected with human beings everywhere. They had the capacity to have relationships with people who spoke different languages and different cultures. I mean, it was just a mind-boggling thing that we still don't fully understand. And then one of the Generation Xers gave them this gift, Facebook. And so there was social media. And again, I think this is something we don't even fully comprehend the impact social media has on how we do life, how we think, how we get our news, how we have relationships with people. So this was the millennials. And coming after that, the heels of them, 1996 to 2012, is the Generation Z. I want to just show you here. I want to start with Gen Z and mention something really unique about this generation. So the early boomers, 18% of the early boomers were ethnic minority. 30% of Gen Xers were from a racially or ethnic minority. 39% of millennials are racial or ethnic minority. 48% of Gen Z, racial or ethnic minority. This is something that is unprecedented in American history. Of course, when Europeans came here, they were a minority, and people of color were people who were the majority. But since that time, and since America was founded, we found most folks who were white lived in a culture in which they were the dominant race, and there were small minorities. Today, for Gen Z, their friends, their family members, likely their spouses, are going to be people of color. So this is a different world than maybe some of you grew up in. In addition to that, if you'll give me this again, post-millennials, or Generation Z, will be the most educated of any generation in American history. Starting with Gen Xers, we know the data. 44% of Gen Xers went to college, 53% of millennials went to college, 59% of post-millennials of Gen Z have gone to college. And so when you think about this, they will be the most educated generation in the history of America as well. These are going to be the people who will be your doctors, they're going to be your lawyers, they're going to be your school teachers, they're going to be your preachers, they're going to be people who you turn to for advice. The reality is today, 40% of Americans work for somebody younger than themselves, and if you're still in the workplace in the years ahead, you're going to be working for somebody younger than yourself. And this generation is going to be the generation that's going to be leading us, the Millennials and Gen Z together. Okay, this is also the first generation that had a president that looked like this. 2 generations before, people were fighting to be able to not give up their seat on a bus. And President Obama becomes the first president, a person of color. Then we recognize that this generation is growing up with devices that they can touch screen devices. So I think about Stella as my 5-year-old granddaughter. She's actually the generation after Generation Z. She's Generation A, I think they're calling it, but I'm not really sure. But she's grown up with iPads from the time she was like 2 years old. She got my old iPads, and I had to get her a new one the other day for Christmas because she couldn't, it couldn't upload the new stuff on that old iPad that we had. So, the other day, Levon was using FaceTime, and we were trying to talk to somebody, and it wasn't working right. And who's she going to hand her phone to figure it out? Well, she starts to hand it to our 5-year-old granddaughter, and so finally hands it to our daughter. But Stella, she's a digital native. She has grown, not just digital native, she is immersed in this because this is the only world she knows. This generation, they don't send letters, they don't even email, that's so old school. It's, texting, and you don't even take the time to text words, you text emojis so that you don't even have to, waste the time with extra letters there. They're breaking the mold in almost every way, and with the millennials, they care deeply about social justice and inclusion. Inclusion is really a huge deal for millennials and Gen Z. We're going to talk more about that in just a couple of weeks. And this is also the generation who's grown up, and instead of ducking under desks because the nuclear war was coming, they had to duck under desks because there was an active shooter in the school. And that's what they've learned about. All right, so it's important for us to recognize again, these generations, the millennials and Gen Z, this is not the future, this is the present. The 2 largest generations alive today, and they're going to fundamentally reshape what the world looks like, and they have questions and they have concerns. And we're going to listen to them to try to understand. One of those concerns is the polarization in our country. On nearly every survey and every poll of Gen Z and millennials, you find this rises near the top. They are deeply concerned about how divided we are as a nation. In 2018, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, CIRCLE is the acronym, at Tufts University did a survey of 18 to 24-year-olds. This is just a year and a half ago. 82% of young adults said that they were concerned about the values of the American people. I want you to catch this. In generations past, the older generations were concerned about the values of young adults. Today, young adults are concerned about the values of everybody who's older than they are. And then when it came to the concerns they had about those values, they were deeply concerned. One of the most important values they were concerned about was how we treat each other and the polarization in our country. So that 57% of this generation indicated they were losing faith in American democracy. We feel it in Washington. We feel it in conversations in our own families at Thanksgiving time. We feel it on social media. So we asked young adults, what is it that you're, in our congregation, what are the experiences you have with polarization in your families, or, what are you feeling? And I just wanted you to hear their personal experiences. Take a listen.
Most older generations have such strong opinions that I am nervous to talk to them about my beliefs and my opinions. I've kind of been told by my parents to not bring it up around older generations just because I'm supposed to respect the people older than me, and I can get heated about my topics that I am passionate about.
When you look at Congress, for example, and you see a bunch of baby boomers in power leading the country down a path that many would agree is polarizing.
In my family, we have very different political opinions and views. Some of the older generations in our family have some, whereas my sister and I, who are both millennials, have very different ones. We find it very difficult in our family to have those conversations without it growing into something that's negative and that creates arguments or hurt feelings. I would love to see that begin to change and us to address that and address how to have good conversations and healthy conversations.
And so it's frustrating to view the political system just because we're stuck.
We are stuck. There's nobody in this room who would disagree with the fact that we're stuck. I think about one of the studies came out last year, talked about Thanksgiving meals. And do you know families are spending less time at Thanksgiving meal together now? And do you know why they're spending less time at Thanksgiving meal? Because younger generations find it hard to stay with their parents and grandparents for the length of time they used to, because the thing that we want to talk about the most, or at least the thing that's overwhelming for us, is what's going on in our society. And when we talk about that, we start to fight. So you know what, we'll have dinner, we'll share a little bit of time, maybe watch some football, and we're going to cut out about a half an hour earlier than we used to, because it's just too hard to hang around with people who disagree and feel and see things so differently than we do. We're going to talk about this next week when we talk about mental health, which is one of the critical issues for young adults. But a study from the American Psychological Association in 2018 found that Generation Z is the most stressed out generation in the history of America, well, as long as they've been doing studies. Why are they so stressed out? Well, part of the stress has to do with the environment we live in, where there's constant conflict all the time. Stress, anxiety. Now, the Pew Research Center has been doing polling since 1994 on Republicans and Democrats to see sort of how close are we together or how far apart are we. And I just want to show you some of the data that they have. So if you'll give me the iPad. So this is 1994. And what we have here is these are the people who are consistently liberal, and these are the people who are consistently conservative. And then, let's switch this. And then we have the median Democrat and the median Republican. And you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of people, everybody's sort of mixed in here in the middle, right? This is where most people were in 1994. Let's see where they are in 2017. Let me go backwards again. There's 1994. There's 2017. Look how small that circle has gotten in between here. And these folks have shifted to the right, and these folks have shifted to the left. And this sort of is no wonder that we are struggling. Now, what's interesting is, still to this day, when you actually survey people about where they find themselves, 2/3 of Americans say, I'm here in the middle somewhere. But that's not what it feels like. And sometimes we find ourselves sort of migrating further and further to the left or right. This week I was listening to Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist at New York University, and there was a podcast where he was talking about polarization. And he says something I thought was really important. He says there are a number of major, serious problems that we are facing as a nation and as a world, and they are all solvable problems if we would talk with each other. But so long as we decide that you have one answer and I don't like your answer and I'm not interested in talking to you and I've got another set of answers and you've got to agree with me or else I'm not going to talk with you, we're going to find that we can't, in his words, we will not solve these solvable problems because we cannot talk to each other across the divide. We have to learn to listen. Now, the polarization has been going on for years. But it's getting worse. And why is it getting worse? Well, Haidt talks about this, but others have talked about this as well. Part of what's happened is that we tend to live with people, live in the same communities, neighborhoods. We go to the same churches with people who see the world the same way we see it. So, we value sameness. And so as we value sameness, the people who live around us tend to think the same way. And if most people, if somebody doesn't think that way, they're usually quiet because it feels uncomfortable bucking the crowd. And we tend to find churches where everybody agrees with, how we see the world by and large. And then we look for news sources, and we know the different news sources and what they stand for and represent. We tend to look for news sources that confirm our own feelings or thoughts. This is called confirmation bias. And so, we look for news sources that confirm that. It used to be we had 3 news stations, 4, 5, and 9, or ABC, CBS, and NBC. And, everybody listened to one of those 3. But anymore, you can really pick and choose which of the news stations is the one that best represents what your feelings are about the world. You don't have to do any research. You don't have to see if your biases are correct or not. You're going to find somebody who will confirm all your biases, whether you're on the left or on the right. We do the same with social media. 59% of millennials and Gen Z, 59% of Gen Z, have as their primary news source social media. So social media is brilliant because you can find, outlets that describe exactly how you feel about everything. And then you get feeds that are going to be constantly telling you, what you want to hear, without actually taking the time to listen to people who stand on the other side, might have a different view that might actually be accurate. All of these things have moved us further and further apart. I think about now, we find it really hard to even be together with people who see things differently. So Friday, we announced in the United Methodist Church that there's a plan that's now been put in place to allow the most conservative members of our church on LGBT to leave and form their own denomination. And then probably there will be some folks who are on the farthest left who are going to leave and form their own denomination. And then the rest of us are going to continue to be United Methodist. And this grieves me in ways I can't even express. There are people who are on the further right who I have loved and been in church with and been a colleague with in ministry for a long time, and we don't interpret Scripture the same way, but we think a lot the same way about a lot of theological issues. But now, those folks are saying, we can't be in the same church with you anymore. And then further on the left, the same thing happens. With all of the rest of you over there, we can't be in the same church with you anymore. You know what? We lose something when the people furthest to the left leave. And we lose something when the people furthest to the right leave in the United Methodist Church. They brought something really important to this mix. We have always been a church of the big tent. We are a church where we have Republicans and Democrats and left-leaning and right-leaning, and somehow that helps us be better Christians and better humans because we actually take the time to listen to one another. But anymore, we can't even stay in the same church, even though Jesus told us not to divide. We can't even do that in the church. So that today, somebody asked me at a press conference on Friday, does it really make sense to call yourselves United Methodist anymore? It's a really good question. And some have suggested we really aren't united anymore. We moved the T and the I and we switched their places. Now we're the untied Methodist, right? We are the untied Methodist. Now again, Jonathan Haidt mentions the role that social media plays in polarizing us, and we experience this, right? So here's how it works. I have strong feelings about an issue, politics, whatever, and I'm gonna put together a really brilliant 280-character quote for Twitter, right? And I'm gonna send it out there. It's brilliant. Do you think you can really make a good case for any complex moral issue or any serious political issue in 280 characters? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do this. I'm not saying you shouldn't make your opinions known, but often we put things out there, and it's one thing to say, this is what I believe is right, and it's another thing to go, I'm gonna poke you in the eye. I'm just gonna so irritate you. I'm gonna zing you. Let me just zing you and have you feel like zinged. And see, I can do that because it's not you. You're not sitting with me. I've noticed people will say things on Twitter they would never say if they were looking somebody in the face, right? Or on Facebook or anywhere else, we'll say these things. And so what happens is you say that, and then my blood is boiling because I don't agree with that at all. So I got to come back with a really awesome 280-character, deal, or I might just give you an emoji, right, with my head exploding or something else, or maybe a little pile of excrement or something that I'm going to send to you in an emoji. And so we go back and forth with these things, right? And we get further and further and further apart. I'm not saying we shouldn't express ourselves. I'm just saying maybe we should express ourselves in ways that's consistent with our faith, or maybe we need to go back and read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Because here's the question that I have to ask in every sermon I'm going to preach, and I'm going to say something that's going to be difficult or challenging. I got to ask, is my job to make myself feel better by poking you in the eye, or is it to actually influence you? And if I'm going to try to influence you, then I have to ask, what's the best way to influence people? And sometimes our brilliant little tweets don't do the trick. Sometimes it's not just the brilliant little tweets. Sometimes, it's the things that are on Facebook. And so maybe we don't even write it. We just like it. We like it, and then we post it on our page. I didn't actually say it. Somebody else said it, but I'm going to like it or retweet it. And so we do that, and those are somebody else's zingers, but then somebody gets my tweets, and they see that I retweeted this thing, and they feel like they have to respond to that. And then we end up saying things to each other we would never say, even in families, parents and children. And so we say things, and pretty soon, I don't ever want to talk to you again. I don't want to have anything to do with you because you were mean to me. Or you gave me a thumbs down. I think they've taken the thumbs down away now, but this is what we do with each other. And this is not healthy. It's just not a way that people, actually solve problems and address things. What ends up happening is in a culture that is dictated by this kind of rhetoric and this kind of way of doing things, you find the people on the farthest ends who are already prone towards sort of going off in ways that are unhealthy or hurtful, you find that they're just energized by this. So we find a rise in white supremacy groups that are going on in our country right now. The nation as a whole actually is more embracing of Jewish people and less anti-Semitic than probably at any time in our history. But we have more anti-Semitism going on right now today than we've had in decades, right? As these groups, these sort of fringe groups on the end find themselves, energized by all of this negative rhetoric. And on the far left, we find the same thing in the groups like Antifa. And so there's this negativity. And then what you find is if you find people who are really broken on the ends, like you find people they're really unhinged. They walk into a family as they're celebrating a house, as they're celebrating Hanukkah with a knife. right? Or they take a gun into a church in Texas and they start shooting people, right? Because we live, it's not that, we can blame all of this on that, but we live in an environment where now it's like, I hate you, I'm gonna kill you, because we can't talk with each other civilly. We have a president today who is relatively polarizing, and some people thought President Obama was polarizing. And so, we have very different opinions about President Trump. In this congregation, I received a letter a few weeks ago from a family who said, we really think President Trump may be the very best president in the history of America. And I have somebody else who on Twitter sends me, and she doesn't identify herself, so I have no idea who she is, because I've wanted to reach out and send a note privately to her, but she chastises me with some regularity. Like, your silence is deafening. Why aren't you preaching against the president? Why aren't you speaking out against the president? These are both, presumably, United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. The best president ever, why aren't you preaching against the president? And those people may be sitting next to you. It's really interesting. So I just will say a couple of things about preaching against the president. So I have strong opinions myself, and I recognize your people have strong opinions. And part of what I have to ask is, what actually is the approach that Jesus took when it came to the things that were going on in his day? So I did a study of the Gospels, and I looked to see how many times did Jesus preach against specifically a person, Herod Antipas, or Pontius Pilate, or Emperor Tiberius. Do you know how many I found? None. He actually mentions Herod Antipas once, and he calls him that fox, and that was a negative thing that he said about him, but that's all he says. These people were crucifying Jews. They were doing terrible things. So what Jesus does instead is he starts calling people to live out a life of faith in which God is their king. And he says, the kingdom of God is like this. And he says, this is what you should be doing. You should care for the marginalized. You should care for the hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and in prison and the immigrant or stranger in your midst. And he says, you got to love your enemy and you love your neighbor and you got to practice. This is what it means to be a Christian. You got to be light and salt. And so he's talking about all of these issues, but he's not talking directly about Tiberius or about Pontius Pilate or about Herod. He's calling people to live differently in that world, to be light and to be salt and to address those issues. As there are times I look back and I think, why weren't you more courageous here or there? But there are times where I have desperately wanted us to be able to look at things that are going on in our world and to say, do you really think this is right that we put kids in cages? Surely we can, I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, surely we can do better than that. Right? Or bullying speech towards other people. Right now I'm deeply concerned about in seminary, my focus was on ethics, and in particular on the ethics of war. And when you assassinate somebody, when you specifically target somebody and assassinate them, and then what kind of claims you make after that, like there are places that things can be really reckless. I'm a little worried about that right now. And so I thought to myself, if I could sit down with President Trump, by the way, I'll tell you about President Trump. From my perspective, you didn't come here to hear a talk about politics from me, and I'm not going to give you one, but I'm going to say this. There are several things that he's done that I think were the right thing to do that maybe nobody else would have done because he's a disruptor, and he just thinks differently. And if you're a Democrat and you say, I think there's some things the president did right, you get in trouble for that. And if you're a Republican, anyway, you get the idea. So I thought to myself, what would I say to him if I could sit down with President Trump? I got to do that with President Obama. What would it be like to sit down with President Trump? And can I tell you, I think this is how I imagine the conversation would go, is I think I would start and I would say, hey, you've got a hard job, and I can't imagine having to walk in your shoes and all the criticism, all the stuff that you get. And, thank you for being willing to put yourself out there and try to do this. And I want to tell you, there's several things that I really agreed with that you did. I thought that was really good, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate that. And then after I had done that, I would say, but I think there's some things that we could do better. And I just want to mention, as I read the Gospels, these are some things that I think maybe don't really reflect the kind of Americans we should be or the kind of Christians we should be. And I just want to gently offer these as suggestions to you of things I think we might be able to do differently and better. Now you say, well, that would, either that sounds brilliant or that sounds just totally cowardice. But here's what I've asked over 29 years of ministry as your pastor is, how do you actually influence people? And here's what I've found is when you start attacking people and calling them names, very seldom do they listen to anything you say after that. And if you can't find anything good or you can't treat them as a human being and look at them as a human being, and it's going to be really hard to have a conversation that changes anything. All right, so how do we talk about these things? Well, I think as we talk about these things, we have to look to our scriptures as Christians and see what they have to teach us. We're beginning an election year. Like, this is going to be a really hard year, and I'm picturing in my mind there's 20,000 of you, and what would happen if 20,000 of us begin to actually do what the scriptures teach us? When we stand strong for what we believe, you can have passionate beliefs. Like, you should. I hope and pray that you believe in social justice and concerns for the poor and a whole host of other things. But how do we talk about those things in a way that actually might lead to change? And so as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about in the New Testament, do you know, everyone, as far as I can tell, every one of the 27 books of the New Testament was written against the backdrop of conflict. The Gospels were written, and you can find the conflict underlying the stories in the Gospels. And you find it in the book of Acts, lots of conflict in the book of Acts. And all of the epistles, the book of Revelation, there's conflict everywhere. And so the gospel writers and the apostles, they're addressing that conflict all the time. So 1 Corinthians 13, right? We read this at times at weddings, is when we usually read this. The church at Corinth was deeply divided. They were so broken. And Paul writes these words to them. Listen. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Love here is not a warm, fuzzy feeling. It is a dogged determination to treat you as a human being and to care about you. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. And then he describes what love is. And I'm just going to say maybe this is a good description of how we should use our social media. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth or with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This kind of love never fails. I mean, we got to be people who care deeply about what's going on in our world. We're going to talk about some of those things the next few weeks, but we got to be able to do that in a way that we might actually bring about change. Or we just push people further and further away. Jesus said it this way in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard that it was said, you must love your enemy or love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I mean, that's actually not written in the Bible, but that is how people did things. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you so that you'll be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. That's how we practice politics. I'm going to love the person who's on the other side of the aisle. And the more obnoxious they are, the harder I have to work to love them. But it may just be that the practice of loving that person might just change them, and in the process change me. I love how James says this in his epistle. He says, know this, my dear brothers and sisters, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to grow angry. We're just the opposite. We're quick to grow angry. We are quick to speak or use social media, and we're slow to listen. But James is telling us just the opposite. This is because an angry person, he says, doesn't produce God's righteousness. If those who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. Wesley and the early Methodists, they were living in a time that was deeply polarized. Even the Methodists were deeply polarized. There were Whigs and Tories, I think, at that time in the 18th century in England. And Wesley, gives these 3 general rules for how we practice our faith as Methodists. And in part, he was thinking about the polarization of his time. And this is what he said. The Methodist Christians live out their faith by doing no harm, by avoiding evil of every kind. And he went on to talk about quarreling with each other in ways that was not helpful or productive. Number 2, we live out our faith by doing good, by being in every kind merciful after their power as they have opportunity, doing good of every possible sort and as far as possible to all people. And then finally, by attending upon all the ordinances of God, those things that help us grow in our faith. Listen, you can do that and march. But you can't do that in March and then say hateful things about other people while you're marching, because it just undermines everything that you were just trying to march for. Right? You can do that and be on social media and say, I really think we need to be thinking about this. This really matters. This just can't be right. And still love the people who you're speaking to who totally disagree with you. All right, I want to begin to wrap this up. I saw a movie this last week, The Two Popes. Anybody seen that on Netflix? It's really pretty marvelous little film, I think. And in it, we have Pope Benedict, who wants to retire as Pope. Nobody's done that in like 700 years. And he desperately wants to retire, but he wants to make sure the wrong guy doesn't get to be Pope after him. So he's going to keep going if the wrong guy is going to be Pope. And the wrong guy is Cardinal Bergoglio, who is in Latin America, who ultimately becomes Pope Francis. And he's worried that he's going to become Pope because he totally disagrees with him. So Cardinal Bergoglio totally disagrees with the Pope, and he's ready to retire. He's tired of being a cardinal in the church. So he flies to Rome because he needs the Pope's permission to be able to retire. And he's going there to convince the Pope to retire. And as they start talking, Pope Benedict says, I don't agree with anything you say to Pope Bergoglio. I disagree with everything that you say, your positions, everything. But they spend 2 days together. And at the end of 2 days together, listening to each other and hearing each other's stories, something changes. And suddenly Pope Benedict decides that maybe it would be a good thing for the church to have a Pope, Bergoglio becomes Pope Francis. Here's the scene where this happens. Take a look. I don't know if that scene actually happened in real life, but I love the picture of it. That Pope Francis, who was very conservative in a lot of things, looked at Pope Bergoglio or Cardinal Bergoglio and finally said, you know what? I see your heart and I see who you are and I've listened to you, and maybe the church needs what you have. And that's exactly what ended up happening in the end. All right, I end with this. So I told you the story on Christmas Eve, how I ran out of gas. I had another little incident in the car this week. So Levon and I went to the Lake of the Ozarks after Christmas so I could write. I needed to get work done on a book I'm working on, so I'm down there writing every day. And Friday we were coming back. We needed to be back at a certain time, and so we leave. We're in her car. She has a 2014 Ford Fusion Hybrid, and we're driving home, trunk loaded with stuff. And we're on this lake road, and there's this junk in the middle of the road, and I swerved to miss it, but I picked up a huge screw in my tire, in the front driver's side tire. And I could hear this sound, as I'm driving down the road. I'm like, oh, shoot. And then I'm thinking, I pull over and I see the screw stuck in there, a big giant screw stuck in there. And I'm like, okay, hopefully that'll make it for 15 miles till I get to town in Climax Springs where I can get the tire fixed. And so we're driving along, and then pretty soon it gets quiet, which tells me the screw came out. And then all of a sudden I look at my dash and it says, you have a flat tire. So I pull over and I'm like, I can't believe it. I'm pulling all this stuff out of the trunk of the car, and I'm like, suddenly it hits me. I hope this hybrid has a spare tire. Because see, they often will take out the tire and the jack to save weight. And I pull out everything and I open up the compartment underneath there, no spare tire. There is a compressor with gunk in it to fix a flat. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try this. The problem is when your tire goes completely flat, it loses the seal between the tire and the wheel. And the only way that you can get it to air up again is to give it a blast of about 100 pounds per square inch air pressure, which this thing does not make. So I sit there for 15 minutes, nothing. I'm like, who is the genius who thought this was a good idea, really? So then, we have to call a tow truck, and we're at a place where there's just a few places we have signal there. We had one of those places. We called Bill in Climax Springs, and he came out with his tow truck. Bill's a really good guy. I'd never met him before, but I'd heard about him. And Bill comes out with his tow truck, and there we are, Levon and me and our little dog, Maybelle, and we all cram into the front of his pickup truck after he pulls, our car up there and on the back, and we drive into Climax Springs. And, along the way, we're just talking about life. Like, what do you do, Bill? Well, I drive a school bus in the morning, and I drive a school bus again at night, taking the kids to and from school, and I fix tires in the meantime. And I'm a grandparent now, and we start talking about how awesome it is to be a grandparent. And he has a 3-year-old granddaughter, and, he's Papa, and I'm Papa. And we just have this great conversation. We get to the store, and he said, hey, I'm going to get you fixed up as quick as I can. 10 or 15 minutes, I'll get your tire done and on the road. He just saved us. And I walk in, and there on the counter is this sign. Actually, there's not just one. There's multiple of these signs on the counters as I walk in. Now, Bill and I probably are not going to agree about politics, but we are going to agree on some things. There are some places where we're going to agree, and then some places where we're going to totally disagree. But can I tell you something? I love Bill. Bill saved me. And he was a really good guy, and we have grandkids. And we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us. And I'm just encouraging us as we go through this coming year to be people that listen to each other, who are quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to get angry, and that we might be those in the midst of a very polarizing society that might be the answer instead of the problem as followers of Jesus Christ. We're going to end with this prayer of St. Francis. Let's say it together. We'll put it up on the screen. I learned that St. Francis probably didn't write this prayer, but it became really popular during World War I. When people were killing each other across Europe, and became even more popular in World War II, where millions were dying at the hands of others. Let's say it together and make it our prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. God, please help us to live the words of this prayer. Help us to be passionate about the things that you care about. Help us to be careful to recognize that we don't have all the answers, we don't know all the truth. Help us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And help us to love not only our neighbors and the people in our political party who see the world the way we see it, but to love those who see the world differently than we do. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.